Drawing, hard. We all know that, not important. But why is it that when we see our favorite artists draw, not only do we fail to replicate their process, but they themselves seem to ignore the tips and tricks we see every now and again? How do you get as good as art as they are? What? Oh, hey. Yeah, I know, it's been like 3 years. Can we talk about this later? Okay, please, just put the gun down. When I was 6, I saw how they drew the horses in the horse movie. I saw that they used a bunch of scratchy little circles inside of other circles with more circles. So I did the same thing. Yup, nailed it. Can't even tell the difference. Which, while writing this, I realized that might be the reason why I had trouble with line quality. And then a decade later, I saw people drawing lines that split a ball into a plus cross-section looking thing. Little me was like, oh boy, a plus sign on a ball. One for the middle, and now the eyes. Now I can finally make my drawings look as good as my SFM Well, guess I got a new video idea. Later down the road, I discovered the answer to this seemingly unsolvable problem of how come I can't draw well without copying the thingy. But unfortunately, it's one of those things where even if you hear it from someone else, your brain might go, that doesn't make any sense. They must be wrong. Which is more of a brain thing than an art thing. But, I think if you just take a minute to unwrap it, onion by onion, it should make sense. Probably. So, viewer like you, we're gonna talk about how to get form, even if we're struggling with stuff like perspective, color, texture, even lighting. Now, this won't be end-all, be-all, but it'll give you an inch at least how to make your drawings look three-dimensional. That's the goal here, three-dimensional. Which, I would've loved that inch when I was younger. Speaking of younger, back in elementary school and high school, I heard the same thing repeated more times than I can count. These are the elements of art. Line, shape, form, space, texture, value, and color. Alright class, write this down and copy these pictures in the handout. Then we can go back to our normal assignment, and we'll do it all again next week. For 7 years. Thinking back to it, the way they treated it was kind of the equivalent of, welcome kids to your first day of education. This one's chemistry. It deals with chemicals and covalent bonds. Ooh. This one's geology. Tectonic plates. Ah. This one is geometry. Now get this. Parallelograms. Whoa. Alright, good job. You graduated education. Probably not the teacher's fault. It was probably the higher-ups. That and high schoolers are just very tall children. So I knew the word form, but I didn't really know form. Let's just take a crack at this with an explanation and then an example. Form. From the top, form is how you show something is three-dimensional. To create form, it helps to think of two simple questions. The first question is, are the things closer to camera bigger than the things away from camera? You want to make sure that things that are further from you are smaller than the things closer to you, at least if, they're the same size. The second question is, what sides of the object can we see? Can we see the left, top, bottom? Can we see multiple sides at the same time? Which ones are bigger and smaller? So the reason why it's important that you pay attention to the sizes getting smaller is because the size compresses into a straight line as it turns away from you. Shown in this box example. If you really mean for something to be turning, then you should make sure to show the compression based off the angle that you actually want. Beginner artists tend to make the mistake of making both sides equal in width. So generally, it's a good idea to keep in mind how narrow things are, because that implies the direction that the form is facing. If you don't answer these questions, you're gonna end up picking probably just one side. Now, this correlates to perspective a little bit, but if you take a cube, the thing that perspective is basically based on, and you rotate it around in space, literal space, guess what? The horizon line just kind of flies all over the place. That's because
eyeline
only works on things parallel to the ground with it. For example, if the box was flat on the ground, this video isn't really about perspective, so... To create form, you can use cross contours. You can imagine a rubber band going around an object, or maybe marching ants, laser scanning cross sections, whatever works. The idea is that a cross contour is basically a cutout section of the form that you're drawing. But in actual finished work, there usually are no cross contours. Well, except maybe things like belts and stuff. So how do you show cross contours without putting a bunch of belts on people? What you need to do to make form is have everything in the area conform to the implied cross contours. Because guess what? That's what real life does. We'll talk about how to achieve form in another way after our example. Alright, here's an old drawing of mine. Maybe you've seen it before. We've got a head with 2 center lines. The cross contour goes up to the top of the head and then stops. Based off of what we discussed so far, want to take a guess on what's wrong with this? It's because the head has no top plane. Remember one of the questions? Can we see the top of the object? Well, in this instance, we should at least see an indication of the top of the object. Maybe we might not actually be able to see the top of the head, but we should at least not feel like it just gets cut off here. To add on, it's also not actually lined up with the center line. If I imagined that this head was a box, the top plane would look like this. If I created a top plane for the actual head, it would probably go more like this. If I create a top plane for the head I think I was going for, it would probably go more or something like this. Now we're beginning to see why not just that this drawing is bad, but more importantly, why the form in these drawings are bad. They were attempting to be three-dimensional without giving any dimensional properties to them. Generally speaking, your eyes are lined up with your nose, right? Your eyes aren't like this way and your nose isn't this way. Your eyes are this way and your nose is this way. They're symmetrical, which means that when it comes to perspective, it makes it pretty easy to track them because they're not different. So even if we're looking up at someone, like if this was a box, we'd be looking up at it like, like this. All these features within this area are going to be the same. And because of that, if I wanted to draw the opposite of this, so instead of looking up at them, we're looking down at them, all I would have to do is just make a bunch of lines like this. And then we got a very blocked in version of a person that we're looking down on. Kind of forgot to put the perspective tip in the perspective section. I made a little easy to understand guide to perspective when I was trying to figure out how this stuff works. When you're looking down at something, the thing goes back in space. It wants to run up to the horizon line because it always wants to go to the horizon line. The horizon line is where everything's at. We're looking at a box that's below us. The box is going to want to go to the horizon line. Even this wants to go to the horizon line. But if we are looking up at a box, that box, when it goes back in space, it also wants to go to the horizon line. So it goes like this. Everything wants to go to the horizon line. So when you're looking down at something, it wants to go up because it does the opposite word. Down, up, down. I probably could have made it a little bit more rhymey than that, but yeah. Oh, and because everything is parallel, it makes it pretty easy to tell if your face is wrong. Perspective is pretty lenient when it comes to really small details. And at the same time, it's really strict. So you can't have things like this unless it's supposed to be that way. But you can have things that are just completely parallel. So pick a direction, whatever direction you want it to be, and then stick with it, at least in the head. Towards the feet, it can like shift towards this or whatever. Now that's how you fix that particular situation. But I recall younger me would have gone, okay, that looks better, but how'd you do that? Which, oof, that's a toughie. I did just explain it. Maybe that made sense to some of you, but I'm probably gonna assume that there's people who didn't quite get that. So I'll give you 2 more answers on that. First, a frustrating one. You just have to learn to feel it. Yeah, I know, that's a really not great thing to hear. It's a little easier than you think it is. The more you try to see, the more you will be able to see. A beginner and people who just don't draw is simply not equipped to see the world for what it actually is. And I don't mean anything deep by that. I just mean if you looked at a pear, a non-artist won't be like, I see the apex of the pear and how it humps over like this and divots like this as it compresses to the end of the cylindrical shape. Although at a certain point, artists don't need to draw the cross contours anymore because they feel it intuitively. Most people will be like, Gumby. Drawing doesn't actually require any talent, but it does require time. Now, not necessarily a lot of time, but you need to actually do it over a large amount of time. 10 minutes a day is actually enough. It doesn't need to be 5 hours a day. That does speed it up, but that is not required. Both walking and talking are almost as complex as drawing. The only difference is that we force ourselves to do it every day since the day we were born. So going by the same way people treat drawing, we're all talented at walking and talking. Well, maybe there's some subjectiveness on that one. So, first answer, learn how to feel it. Try to really look around at things and notice the different sides and see the difference between different objects. What is a cube and what is a cylinder? What's the difference between that? Attempt to continue the cross contour past what you can see and try to see through the object. And then after you try to actually see through it, maybe actually look at the other side of the object and see if you're right or not. It helps if you try to do this by drawing it, by the way. Don't just do it with your eyes. You can, that's a good way of getting passive mileage, but it's more efficient to actually draw it. A good way of thinking of it is if you can't draw it, you don't actually know it. A thing that one of my art teachers said that really stood out to me was, artists get the superpower of X-ray vision, which I've found to be true, although maybe not as sci-fi as that sounds. At some point you'll be able to see things for what they are instead of just pure iconography. And my second answer is, there's more than one way to make form. Shading. Now, let's be clear, cross contours are still at play here, but they aren't represented with line. Instead, they are represented with tone. Now, this video isn't on rendering, so I won't really be covering core shadows and reflective light, but I will be covering edges and how we imply different types of forms with edges. Something that I personally haven't seen anywhere really explained. Mostly showed. The part that has been explained is these two bits though. A hard edge is when you make a mark with full opacity and make a stroke. The meeting between at least two different values or colors is what an edge is. When it's hard, it implies a sharp turn, possibly 90 degrees. Maybe a little less, maybe a little more. The idea is, hey, this is turned, like a box. Like folding a piece of paper. It's as if the cross contour drops off like this. A soft edge is like that pear you mentioned earlier, or round things like a cylinder. This transition between values is much softer than the hard edge. This implies the form is, well, round, balloon in nature. It's as if the cross contours curve around, like this. Now, this is where most videos I've seen stop talking, but I'll keep going for a bit, because a firm edge is any degree between soft and hard. This implies that the form is neither sharp or super round, but like a rounded cube or a cornered cylinder. It doesn't necessarily need to be 50-50 between there. Maybe it's a really hard soft edge. Maybe it's 80-20 on different sides. Maybe it's closer to a soft edge. Maybe it's closer to a hard edge. The difference between this ratio implies how much of a form turn it is. Is it a really round form turn with a little bit of solidity to it? Or is it a really round sharp turn? An example of a really round turn is the wrist on your arm. An arm is neither a cube or a cylinder, so firm edges describe this would-be cross contour, kind of like this. Okay, that should actually be enough, but while this might be a small lighting tip more than a form tip, a lost edge is a very soft edge, to the point where you can't even see the edge. This can be created in a digital program by using a gradient tool, and just stretching it out a bit more, or a really big airbrush. Now, for cross contour's sake, from my knowledge, this doesn't actually really mean too much. All it does is tell our brain, this form here is different from this form over here. And that could be enough to tell our brains that there's a little bit more form there. Because in real life, if you take an object that supposedly has the same color, like paint on a wall, and you color pick it over here, if this moves at all, then it's not the same color, right? But it is the same color. It's just the nature of how light works. It makes things look slightly more three-dimensional that way. Extra. Texture. Now, this isn't a super beginner-friendly topic, so I'll keep it short. Texture follows all the same rules, but they tend to have harder edges, and that's more to do with the different way of creating edges. When dealing with different types of edges, especially in textures, it can be more important to focus on contrast levels instead of edges. A bunch of textures with really low contrast will look soft, even lost even, while harsh contrast can make it look harder. It's important to note that you can do normal gradations within the textures. This sort of thing can be a little bit situational, so take it with a grain of salt though, which, you know, most art rules are that way anyway. Foundations tend to not be broken though. Extra. I wasn't gonna put this in, but I guess I am. Overlap, right? You put something in front of something, and then you put another thing behind it, and then all of a sudden it's like, whoa, this thing is in front of this thing. Isn't that cool? That's really important, because when you draw people and stuff, you put down the features. Look, this neck is behind this head, and this rib cage is behind this neck, and
this midsection is behind this ribcage, and this pelvis is behind. Do you see what's happening? Now that you know why it's important to give things overlap, a short way of doing overlap, I mean, other than just drawing a shape and putting another shape behind it, is T-line. A T-line, you can just imply that this thing is going behind this thing, like that. And this can imply a lot of things. It can imply that there's a hill over here, and we got like these trees, and then it's a road path. There's a big hill, and that slopes down, and then all of a sudden the road goes up, but it gets all thin because of how far away it is. There's like T-lines like that. That's a horrible drawing. There's T-lines that are like this. It could be fat on skin, or what's more better is clothes folds, because clothes folds constantly T-line with each other because there's a lot of overlap there. Alright, hopefully that gave you a bit more to work with. When I first started digital painting, I just put soft edges everywhere without really understanding why I was doing so. Now that you know why different edges exist in the first place, that should give your eyes a bit of a boost with the whole learning how to feel or see thing. Now, for drawing in general, you definitely still need to learn perspective and overlap and all that stuff. But this video's focus was entirely on form. Rudimentary form at that. You could still technically show more form through highlights, but I feel like I probably shouldn't cover that in this video. That's something you'll understand more if you understand this stuff thoroughly. Okay, yeah, I know, I'm sorry. I kept trying to make videos every now and again, but I kept getting busy with stuff. Art's hard. Not to mention the videos I were making were way too complicated, and I kept losing faith that the videos were even gonna make sense. Art is a dense topic, and I don't want to overwhelm people. Anyway, as long as there's people who benefit from these things, I'll continue to make them. It might take me a while, but like I mentioned before, there are some SFM videos I technically could still make on my own, but if you guys have any suggestions, let me know. As well as drawing ones, since that's probably the direction I'm going now. This one was entirely based on form, and while it's a good chunk of the pie, it's a pretty big pie. So hopefully more videos like this on different topics. Maybe more complex ones down the line. Oh yeah, I'm still on both Instagrams like I mentioned before, as well as Twitter. Wonder if that name's coming back. Anyway, I really hope you enjoyed it or benefited from this video in at least one way or another. Have a good. Alright, good job. You all educated.